Hello, Jeando.
Hello, Kevin.
We've been talking about the concerted use of the mechanisms so that there's more than one mechanism. A person has more than one mechanism. And if they're going to learn to improve their use, then they need to use more than one mechanism together in a concerted way. So you were talking last time about how this plays out in the if and what the correct standing position would be, and how the mechanisms of the legs and feet connect with the torso. So can you talk a little bit more about that, please?
Yes, it's a good idea to continue because Alexander has changed the way he presents his technique along the years. And when he started, it was all a question of a series of acts, series of movements. And it's quite interesting that the word series of acts or series of movements starts to disappear. And in the last book, it's replaced by the concept of pattern of movements. And I think that many people do not connect the two things together. They do not realize that pattern of movements and series of movements is one and the same thing. In fact, it's just two different words to describe the same concept. And it's interesting to take a practical view on what Alexander is saying, because otherwise you may read what he says and not get any clue about what he's really talking about. And I believe, well, that's really a personal belief. I believe that Alexander is a very practical man. Very often you have the impression that he goes on to a very high level of philosophy or reasoning, but in fact it's all based on very tangible facts. So I like to stick on tangible facts. So I'm going to implement what I said last time. We discussed a part of the Universal Consent Living, a chapter I really like. It's not even a chapter, it's the introduction that was written just 2 years after he wrote the book. So last time we saw this. Yeah. He wanted to show that any attempt on man's parts to bring about changes in his own reaction or that of others must begin by throwing overboard the conceptions and beliefs that are associated with the feeling upon which he has previously relied for guidance and control in the use of himself in carrying out of his activities. He will need to substitute for these a new conception leading to belief in new procedures if he's ever to understand what is necessary to the making of a fundamental change in reaction. It's interesting to examine what he's talking about. And in order to examine it, we have to take a very practical example. And for a practical example, I found, of course, the manner of reaction to the stimulus to stain. And I have taken, well, the example of a teacher that is having lessons with me. He's already, of course, a fully qualified Alexander teacher. And he decided at one moment that it could be interesting to start to see what are the new procedures I'm proposing. He was very curious of what it was. And so I just took a few pictures from a lesson he had with me in order to demonstrate that it's necessary to throw overboard the conception and belief that are associated with the idea that the feeling sense is capable of guiding us, or that once the feeling sense has been reeducated, then the person can trust his feeling to react. So we just started here the idea of reenacting the wall procedure as it is described by Alexander in 1907. And so in his description, there are two possibilities that he presents. He says the pupil can be standing with his back toward the wall at either 6 inches to his heels or 12 inches. So we are going to start with the 6 inches procedure. So that's it. We have a teacher and he's standing according to his feeling sense. We must suppose that he's trying to show his best use because, well, he's having a lesson. And, well, it's clear that in the lessons we are implementing, of course, the principle of the Alexander technique. So he's certainly implementing what he knows, and his activity is also a, well, front end of what he does with himself during the day. And so it's necessary to analyze the position. We are seeing only a position because, well, it's a fixed image, and very often I show fixed image to my student. I showed this image to the student during the lesson so that we could discuss what was in evidence. Of course, I've added to this image a grid. And I discussed with my student the necessity of this grid. There is a grid that is showing mainly for the moment, well, the vertical of the front of the ankle. We want to see how is the torso used by the person relatively to the support of the floor. And the support of the floor comes from the foot. And the foot is articulated with the rest of the structure through the ankle joint. So I have a habit to take not the ankle itself, which is much further back than the line I'm presenting. I'm just presenting a line that the student can relate with easily because it's the front of the bone. It's the front of the lower part of the tibia, just close to the ankle. So we organize the situation so that we can know where the vertical of the room is, and we want to see how the person is using the torso in relation with the support. So that's what is shown here. There is a second line that is of interest. It's, of course, the line that separates the superior part of the torso from the middle and lower part of the torso. We consider it's a Delsart division of 3 parts of the torso. So we consider there are 3 parts of the torso. And it's interesting for the pupil to note where roughly we get that separation. If you want to consider it for yourself, it's very simple. You touch the lower part of your sternum bone, and it will give you, well, a fairly correct representation of the separation of the middle torso relative to the superior part of the torso. So we start to discuss, and when we discuss, of course, there is this notion of manner of reaction, because the person is standing in space, the person has to balance. So at the moment, the teacher may not fully realize that he's in the process of reacting to a stimulus, a postural stimulus, so a postural equilibrium. But that's what we see. And you will see later when it's time to, well, move to go the 6 inches necessary to touch the wall, because the teacher well knows it's been indicated to him to place a ruler on the floor at roughly 6 inches away from the wall. And so the teachers exactly know where he is. He's exactly where he is relative to the wall, or that is supposed, because he has organized the room himself, and so he's not taken by surprise. And so it's interesting. I wanted to compare what we see, because sometimes it's difficult to realize exactly what we see. You see a person standing, that's it. You see that, well, of course, there is a protruding abdomen, but both, that's it. The person is standing quite upright, and apparently all is well. Maybe not. And so there is maybe an unwanted pattern. Alexander is talking in the 4th book about an unwanted pattern. And I wanted to show clearly, explicitly what we mean by that. So what he says is that we have a student, and the unwanted pattern was particularly noticeable in his breathing. Oh, yes, the student standing in front of a wall has to be breathing. So we could say that the pattern is noticeable in breathing. The teacher was knowing he was standing in front of a wall. He knew he had to breathe, and yet he was breathing in the pattern we have seen on the picture. When he was trying to rest in a chair, when he was moving an arm or a leg, or taking part in an ordinary conversation. The relative position of the head to the neck and of the head, neck, and torso to the limbs was habitually being interfered with. At the moment, we don't exactly know what is to interfere with the general pattern, but Alexander is going to give us a description. This afforded proof that as soon as he gave consent to perform any act, messages were projected, which resulted in an interference with his direction of the primary control, causing overactivity and a gradually increasing tension, not only in the group of muscles concerned, but also in others, which were taking a too prominent part in the performance of the act. And he continues. As soon, therefore, as he gave consent to doing anything in an endeavor to help himself, these impeding influences at once came into play, operating against him in his doing, as they would operate against him in any doing in physical culture, remedial exercises, or any other method. And here comes the description of the interference with the primary control. The deformity of the neck, the fixation of the cervical spine and head, the rounded humped back, the uneven position of the shoulders, the undue lordosis and slight lumbar curve of the spine, the extreme anterior position of the pelvis in standing, the unduly protruded abdomen, the contracted chest, and the undue tension of the arms and legs, even when he was in a sitting position, his habitual tendency to slump when seated, all these were evidence of the vicious circle involving reflex spasm in overaction of muscle groups, which Dr. Caldwell wrote was further menacing the deformity and increasing the pain. And he wraps it up with a general description. To put it simply, a person manifesting these conditions is being gradually pulled down and bent forward. The forward bend being chiefly from the pelvis, in much the same way as if his feet were fastened to the floor, and if he were being, day by day, more and more pulled forward and down by means of a rope fixed round the neck. When I read these descriptions, at first, I could not make sense of it. If you're pulled down day by day, forward and down by rope around the neck, we should see a different bend. We should see a C bend. We should see a person that is arching forward with the middle of the curve, of the shortening curve, being pulled backward. But there is sense in what Alexander is saying. There is sense, especially if you're reacting to the stimulus of your equilibrium. You're reacting to the stimulus of your habitual feeling sense. And so when that person is standing, well, the first thing that is obvious is the extreme forward position of the pelvis. When you consider the extreme position of the pelvis, you have to understand that this extreme position must be judged relative to the support. It has to be judged relative to the ankle or to the feet. Yeah. And so in this case, it's obvious that despite his long somatic training, his long training to re-educate his sensory appreciation, his habitual response to the equilibrium stimulus, to the positional stimulus, is the same as the one described by Alexander to, in fact, present the unwanted pattern. Of course, interference with the primary control. It's obvious that in this standing attitude, the limbs and trunks are not aided and influenced by gravity. If you remember, this is the sentence I was using. I took it from the Man Superior Inheritance, where Alexander describes the best standing position. So it's something to see that position, but now it's something else to understand what Alexander has to say about the messages that are being sent. Because many people think that in reaction to a stimulus, the person is sending messages to the muscles directly. I believe this is an incorrect position, an incorrect perspective on our capacity to direct our activity. It is much safer to imagine that the messages are messages that are messages of movements, intentions of movements. You can have an intention of movement before, in actual practice, realizing that movement. So, for example, when I look at the teacher having the lesson, the first thing I see is that, of course, there is a protruding abdomen, there is a very shortened lumbar region, but it's simply the result of two intentions of movements. We see that there is an intention of movement, or we can formulate an intention of movement for the pelvis to go forward away from the wall. And of course, in order not to fall forward and maintain the equilibrium, maintain the habitual feeling of equilibrium, the person is sending a message to, in fact, pull the upper torso backward. These two movements are the cause of the position we see here. So it is then possible to imagine to start working with these intentions of movements. Working with intentions of movement or working with a pattern does not mean working with one intention after the other. What is important here is the series of movement, the pattern, how the pattern is organized. And then when you see this kind of representation of our activity, you have a way to start to, well, interact with your own activity and your own reaction pattern. You can think, okay, I could simply change the whole reaction pattern. As if the interference with the primary control was an interference with the whole pattern, not an interference with the neck or with the shoulders or with the abdomen. No, an interference of the whole. So it could be possible then to imagine that, well, if you analyze correctly, when I say to that person, well, would it be possible for you to, well, generate two intentions of movement at the same time? That is, one is to go backward with the pelvis and go forward with the upper torso. So it's simply at looking at what the person is habitually doing in his response. You must remember that that person is a somatic teacher trained to listen to his feelings, and apparently he doesn't feel what he's doing. Or because when he's standing in that manner, his idea is that he's, well, releasing. He's releasing. And when I'm going to ask him to start directing his activity, for example, when I ask him to move his pelvis backward, his first response will be, but that is increasing the activity in my legs. I am doing something with my legs. I'm not releasing. So what is happening is that the person is feeling something that is different from, well, his habitual feeling sense when he's reacting to the stimulus of living. Yet, what he says about doing something is contradicted by the fact that, well, if you look at the geometry and the physics, you will find that, of course, the limbs and trunks are much more affected by the force of gravity in a positive way in this picture than in the previous one, where, well, it was obvious that the man is having gravity affecting the different parts, well, in an unwanted way. And we know that if the person continues to feel at rest in this position, well, the vicious circle is going to increase because the whole weight of the torso is set in front of the foot. So an enormous physical activity is requested, and it does not matter that the person does not feel it. It's not because you don't feel something that it's not true, that it doesn't exist. So we suddenly discover that what is known by this teacher is wrong. Trusting to his feeling sense to stand does not provide the correct pattern. When he continues to trust his feeling sense, supposedly reeducated by his long training in the modern Alexander technique, well, he's just equivocated. It's just not true. And so we start asking questions. What is great about this idea is that, well, we have the wall procedure. So for the moment, the teacher is nowhere near the wall. Could you imagine that I requested for the person to fall against the wall? In 2 seconds, I said to the person, could you count 1, 2, 3, and in 2 seconds, well, fall against the wall. Remember that the wall is 6 inches behind you. Yeah, there is no risk involved. But we want to make, well, projection in the future. If you were to fall against the wall, where do you think you would hit first? Would you hit first with the buttocks, which are the lower torso, or with the middle torso, beneath your sternum, or with your shoulders? And the teacher told me I would land with my back, with my middle torso first. But I say, fine, let's bring that intention to the fore and really make it a deliberate attempt. You really want to produce that movement. And so it's possible then to start to see what the teacher is going to do to prepare for landing with the back. Because what is very interesting is that this was the result of the teacher moving the pelvis backward and the upper torso forward. That's how he could, well, what he could manage to do. And then we started with this idea of falling against the wall. Immediately, the teacher prepared himself. And to prepare himself to fall with the middle torso against the wall, he must have relied on his feelings, I think, because the first thing he did was completely stop and forget the new deliberate direction of movements and replace it with his habitual standing position, with the middle torso thrown forward and compensating with the upper torso too far back. So when you present these images to the students, then suddenly the student is confronted with what he felt. He didn't feel, he prepared, he didn't feel anything. It was just, he was just getting ready for falling against the wall. And getting ready to fall against the wall is a reaction to the postural stimulus. We can already, well, the teacher can already predict, the person that is watching the scene can already predict what is going to happen, what is the pattern the person is always using when stimulated in equilibrium. And so we will discover that when we try to, change the pattern. So I said to the person, well, you are falling against the wall with the shoulders all the time. So we had a second try and we said, we want to have the pelvis directed forward and the upper torso forward while the middle torso is going back to touch the wall. And the person was not able to do it. The stimulus of the fall was too strong. Of course, the person knew that the wall was behind him, but it doesn't matter. The person was so used to following his feelings that just moving these 6 inches backward was sufficient to throw the whole pattern, back to the subconscious way, back to the somatic direction, back to the feeling direction. And so the idea is to change that direction. And this is what Alexander calls a fundamental change. If you go for a somatic training, when you start, you're trusting to your sensation to, do any act, even re-educatory act. At the end of that training, somatic training, you're still trusting to your feeling sense. You're still believing that your feeling sense has been re-educated by the work of your teachers, of your somatic teachers with their hands, and you have made no, fundamental change. The fundamental change starts when you start realizing that you need another way of directing the whole pattern. You cannot trust nature. You cannot trust your feeling of rest, your feeling of release. It's absolutely obvious that the teacher in falling is in fact reinforcing the same wrong pattern, with the abdomen protruding, with the humped shoulders, with the shortened back. And what is interesting is that we see an increase in that pattern. We see that the teachers has clearly lifted the lower sacrum, the lower end of the spine. And you must understand that lifting the lower end of the spine is just shortening the back. I was asked recently a very simple description of what is the technique I'm teaching. The simplest description I can give is that I teach people to react by lengthening the torso, no matter what the reaction can be, no matter what the stimulus is. And so it's absolutely obvious that the 6 inches stimulus is starting the very, very wrong pattern. After a while, the teacher starts to become capable of changing very slightly the pattern. We see that there is a strong resistance to change a pattern, especially when it comes to having the upper torso be directed forward and upward. The direction backward of the torso is so associated by the individual with the idea of lengthening that at first the person has the impression of shortening when lengthening the back. Therefore, as his training is to lengthen, he continues to shorten the back in order to lengthen the front, because lengthening the front gives him the feeling that he's doing the lengthening, that he's just performing, or that the lengthening is happening. He has not the impression of performing the lengthening, because that is not something a modern Alexander teacher would present as his model. His model is to do nothing, is to release and let the right thing happen. But the right thing is lengthening. And so he needs to have a feeling of lengthening, and his feeling of lengthening is coming from, of course, unduly lifting the front parts of the chest, and thereby protruding the abdomen and shortening the back. So we see that the conception of lengthening is central. It's absolutely necessary that this teacher realize his current conception of lengthening and start to question it and question whether it's really lengthening or if it's a feeling of lengthening that is after. And so we play with this idea, and we see that there are some movements that are closing the gap between the shoulders and the upper torso. And it's necessary for the teacher to suddenly have guidelines, have truly experimental guidelines where he can orientate his activity. And we can start saying, could it be possible to create a distance between the top of the thoracic spine, well, the first thoracic vertebrae, and the wall? Could it be possible to not pull back with the upper torso all the time? Could it be possible to compensate and obtain a movement of the middle torso by lengthening the back, which means getting the upper torso and shoulders away from the wall? And so that is why I request the teacher to start using the arms, because the idea is for the teacher to start wearing the shoulders further forward on the torso. The teacher is always wearing the shoulders very far back, and as a result, the weight of the arm has a tendency to pull the upper torso backward. It's possible to widen the shoulder blades away from one another, and therefore create an elastic connection between the mechanism of the arm and the mechanism of the upper torso. Instantly, when I ask the teacher to wear, of course, the arms forward, the teacher can start to very marginally move, because you see there that is the habitual standing posture at 6 inches to the wall, and this is the new one, and you can see that it's very, very minute. The person is not capable of creating long movements. Of course, if you want the upper torso to go against the wall, you must understand that it's necessary to lengthen all the fascia and muscle of the back. And the moment the teacher is not used to that, and if he were to move the upper torso forward while he's keeping the pelvis back, two movements at the same time, well, he would feel stretch. He would feel what he calls tension. And he says, wow, I am feeling tension now. So this is the game we are playing at. And I start asking the teacher now to examine what it is to fall forward. The pupil, the teacher, I call him the pupil, but this person had no difficulty accepting the idea that if he was standing at 6 inches with his ear away from the wall, he had to fall backward. It makes sense, of course. I question the verb falling, yeah, because falling is for most people normally going downwards. Yet, when we observe the different experiments the teacher has done, we see that the teacher is certainly not down. So if he's fallen compared to his habitual pattern, he's fallen upward. And in my book, if he could just get the upper torso completely away from the wall, remember the upper torso is above that grid line, horizontal grid line, then for me, he would just be standing. He would be standing with the trunk and limbs influenced by the force of gravity, which means that the trunk and limbs would be aided in the sense of they would be vertical. It's just standing for me. For him, it's falling against the wall. For me, it's getting out of his habitual pattern that is pulling him down, as we said before, pulling him down with the pelvis forward, as if his feet were fastened to the floor, and he was being day by day pulled more forward by means of a rope fixed around his neck. You look at this image and you look at the new one and you think, oh dear, yeah, there is something in this. And I want the student to realize that we are suddenly discussing conceptions, that we are, in fact, trying to see and to reason out what could be a new pattern. And in the new pattern, it's obvious that we are discussing not only the movement of the pelvis and upper torso, but we are discussing also the movement of the knees and the movement, of course, of the neck and head. Because at the moment, he's pulling back with his head and neck all the time, as you must see. He's got no, information about this. He doesn't feel anything. For him, he's just, suffering a difficult lesson where, he's not doing things according to his habitual criterion. His feeling criterion are, in fact, absent here. It feels all wrong. It feels all strange. So we start to see that he can start falling. And I want to have him start falling. And in falling, again, we discover, this time it's falling up, but forward. We can discuss between ourselves this idea of organizing the movement during the fall. Of course, when you fall forward, it's like when you fall backward, there is a pattern. We can see what is falling forward first. And it's absolutely obvious that when the pupil is falling first, is falling according to his sensory appreciation, he will fall first with the knees, he will fall first with the middle torso, and he will tend to react by pulling the upper torso backward and shortening the back. In this image, you see the person falling forward. Yes, and the person has the realization that he is falling forward and he's trying to fall forward with his shoulders, accelerating much faster than his knees. You can see something is that when the person is falling in that way, for me, he's not yet falling. He's upright. But it's interesting to note that every time the teacher is starting to move the upper torso forward, relatively to the movement of the middle torso that is not falling forward as fast, we can see that the person is collapsing the neck and head. Well, for the moment, I just have to accept it, but because it's the only way for that teacher to move the upper torso forward and upward. It's just a wrong habit, but for the moment, we have so much to construct that this is, acceptable. I don't take notice of it. I see it, but I don't say anything. And so we can also start to imagine the unknown, reasoning from the known to the unknown. Reasoning from the known to the unknown is quite simple in lessons. I just ask questions. So I show the person that now when he's falling with his back much, before falling with the upper torso. We don't even want the upper torso to fall back. There is still a movement of the neck and shoulders backward. He cannot repress that for the moment. He cannot inhibit these movements when he accelerates the knees in the way is requested. But it's always possible in the sense of reasoning from the known to the unknown to create, to imagine other ways to react. So imagining some parts of the pattern going the way they are going at the moment, because he's really doing well in the sense that he's accelerating the knees back. He's really starting to not lift the lower sacrum when he falls backward. He's really starting to direct his activity according to explicit direction. So that is what we call the conscious work. But I can always ask him to see, imagine something. Imagine that it could be possible to lengthen the back. What would be the result to lengthen the back? And I very often use simple collage, like the one what you're seeing here is just a collage. I just cut the picture and set the top of the picture in a different way. And I said, well, how could we get the first thoracic vertebrae, which is a spot that the student will easily locate at the very top of the back of his t-shirt. And I say, it could be possible to imagine how to get the upper torso forward. And very often the teacher is just waiting there because he's never, well, imagined anything like this. And for the moment, it's just like a crazy idea. Yeah. But we can start to discuss what it could be. It could be, well, we could push forward. Yeah, but that would be very difficult. So there is another way, is to imagine that there is a rib cage inside the upper torso and middle torso. And for the upper torso to be so far back and the lower torso to be so far forward, the rib cage must be rotated with the upper rib cage back and the lower rib cage forward. So I start to, well, create this idea that it could be possible to have the upper rib cage move forward and the lower rib cage move back. So the teacher starts to get a representation of different movements that could lead, that could be the means whereby of lengthening the back. And so presenting these images, well, it's quite funny in a sense, but in a sense, it's very educative because the teacher has never imagined that he could direct the upper torso forward and upward. He's been so entranced in the idea that his teachers were, well, having him like incorporate into his somatic knowledge what it is to lengthen the back. For him, lengthening the back, what was he was doing? And suddenly, lengthening the back can be a mechanical organization of a pattern of movements. And so that is a completely new idea, and it's worth investigating. So the student is led to ask questions and think, wow, yes, I could do this. And very often I go to all sorts of graphics and descriptions so that the person can start imagining a new use, an unknown. That is, the teacher is seeing what he's doing on screen, and it's necessary for him to imagine something else. Imagine the possibility of an unknown. And the possibility of an unknown is very simple. It's an organization of movements of different parts at the same time. And so we are back to the means whereby principle. Now, in the Universal Constant in Living, the fourth book, Alexander makes different mentions of the use of the self. One in the introduction and also at the end of the book. So that's what he says. Those who have read the account of the evolution of my technique in the use of the self will be aware that I was continually led into unknown experiences. And when employing new means whereby, found myself in unfamiliar situations and experiencing impeding and eliminating adventures in dark places. This was appreciated by the late Joseph Rowntree when he said of my technique that it was reasoning from the known to the unknown, the known being the wrong and the unknown being the right. So when I read this comment, I suddenly realized that when Alexander is talking about his technique, he's talking of the technique he employed with himself. But that was not the technique I received from my teachers. My teachers, well, they they could, well, of course, bring me into unfamiliar situations, but they were directing the different movements of the different parts of the torso. I was not. I was not, in fact, driving myself in dark places. I was not reasoning from the known to the unknown, and I don't think my teacher were either. They were not reasoning. They were applying a formula. They were trying to get something that could feel right in their hands. This has very nothing to do with continually evolving new experiments, continually exploring unknown places. And so I suddenly realized that I had to change my way of teaching. I was a touch teacher when I started, of course, and it was the idea of patterns, of directing consciously a whole primary control, as if the primary control is not what you do with your head and neck relatively to the torso, but it's what you do with the head and neck relatively to the torso and relatively to all the other parts, which means a global pattern. This experience of passing from a known to an unknown manner of use of the self is the basic need in making a fundamental change in the control of man's reaction. And it will remain important in meeting it, unless it is possible to give him the opportunity of accepting an unfamiliar theory and of acquiring the experience of employing consistently the unfamiliar procedures which are its practical counterpart, by means of an integrating process of reconditioning associated with experiences of use and functioning previously unknown to him. Although these experiences feel wrong at first, they will gradually replace the old experiences which felt right. And in time, the new experience becomes established as a constant in the use of the self in daily activity. So when I was training, we were supposing that it was sufficient for the teachers to bring us to experience the new organization. And after a while, these experience will become established. You've seen the videos, you've seen the pictures of the different teachers that are working with me, and some of them have worked many, many years with this idea in mind. And my impression is that this experience of passing from the known to the unknown, using conscious directions of movements in the whole pattern, is something they do not understand. They have never approached. They have never been trained like this. And so it is necessary to realize that at one moment, when we see that it's possible to pass from the known to the unknown by reasoning, is to understand that we need certain tools to reason. We need to become capable of analyzing the different actions that are making the pattern. We must be capable of memorizing instructions, and we must also have some tools that will help us to verify that when we are responding to the stimulus, when we are falling 6 inches, well, what a great fall, then we are responding with a reason reaction. That is certainly going to feel absolutely wrong. And the surprise is that it's not going to feel wrong for just the first few tries. Believe me, I've been falling against the wall for many, many years, and still I discover new dark places in this organization of the movements of the parts when you fall against the wall. It's not like something that you do when you start the training, when you start exploring what is the initial Alexander technique. No, it's something you can explore nearly, I think, all your life. So this is another episode about what Alexander called learning to do. And so, have you got questions?
Yes, I'm just interested in the last thing you said, because in the Alexander world, people will say things like, the wrong thing feels right because it's familiar, and if you do the right thing, if you do something else, then it will feel wrong because it's new, it's unfamiliar. But what you said is really important. It's not that you ever get to the stage where your feeling is perfect and it's always accurate and it feels right. That's, I think, a mistake an assumption people come with sometimes, is they think that if I just need to get this good at feeling and sensing, then everything will be okay at some point and it'll be accurate, and then I can just forget about all this conscious guidance business and just let it happen by itself. That's kind of it's behind a lot of the mindset. It's behind a lot of the actions that people do, because they're like the releasing things is just looking for, I don't need to make a decision, I can just let this go and then it'll all take care of itself for me. It's an ongoing they're not taking responsibility for your own movements and your own decisions of movements.
It's exactly what Alexander is saying in the next chapter. He's talking about man's responsibility to take care of himself, and he's talking about this dream that we can trust nature, and the natural concept is always present in the somatic discussions. Doing something, is it natural to do this? How should I move naturally? And it's I was discussing this 2 days ago with a singer, and he was also talking about that natural singing. And I said to him, you've been a singer for quite a while now, have you not? And he said, yes. And he said, how many years did you study then? And he started to calculate, and he said 7, 8. Oh yeah, okay. So you're talking about a natural activity then. It's not cultivated, it's not, you're not trained. Yeah, it's like natural. And when you think about it, there are things you can train. When you train and you use reasoning in your training, well, then it's very difficult to think that something is natural.
Well, it's also a misunderstanding of natural, because natural for humans is using the reasoning. That's part of what it means to be natural for human, is reasoning comes with being a human. So it's part of, they're actually making the same mistake they're trying to avoid. They're splitting the psycho and the physical. They're splitting mind and body by thinking that reasoning is just if you're reasoning about movements, then it can't be natural. But that's exactly what is natural for a human being to do, is to use the reason.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's no, they're constantly making a split between intellect and movements. It's as if like your intellect has nothing to do with movements. It's something else, and that's just kind of on top. As if the two things haven't evolved together, both through history, but also in each person's life. You're learning to move and learning to speak and use words to direct your movements and direct your actions. While you're learning to move, it's all intertwined in a person's life.
Yeah, that's correct. And this is the foundation of the initial Alexander technique. How to, in fact, reduce the gap between your speech and your actions, between your thinking and your action. And starting to realize that there are many actions that we do that are based on very unthought concepts and things that are obviously wrong when you start to analyze them. So it's an exploration. We start to explore where we could go using these new procedures, that is directing actions with language. How many actions can we direct at the same time? It's always interesting because it's always new. There is not a moment when you suddenly rest on the feeling and the feeling is taking care of actions for you. The responsibility is always yours.
Well, great. Good place to stop. So for people watching the video, you can book a lesson with Jeando. If you go underneath, there's a link to his website and to you'll get his email address to book a lesson, and we'll see you in the next video. Thanks, Jeando.
Thank you.